Welcome to this panel session on worldwide revolutions. One of the panelists said to me, how does this fit in with the theme of the conference, innovation? Which, being a journalist, I constructed two answers. The first one is that it doesn't, so we should just enjoy it as a break from economics and treat it as politics. As somebody who started a degree in politics, philosophy and economics many years ago, I think that's always a good thing to do. So if you're interested in politics, just regard it that way. But in a way, of course, we are talking about innovation, if you want to rationalize it. We're talking about political innovation and where it leads, positive and negative directions. It's a long time, actually, since I've thought seriously about revolutions. But when I was in my youth, I used to be a historian before I became a journalist. I used to think quite a lot about it, and I had friends who were sort of radical on the left who talked about permanent revolution all the time. I was never really a Trotskyite, but I can now go back and tell them that I've compared a meeting of the Comintern based in Toronto, I think, a discussion about revolution and where it leads. It's not a very fashionable concept these days in the West, of course. I think it's the 1917 revolution. Most people's copybook. Some people would say the 1789 revolution has been held by them. But we're focusing on different parts of the world. Obviously, there have been more encouraging developments recently, the Velvet Revolution in Eastern Europe. And the particular focus we have today is the Arab Spring and its aftermath. I don't pretend to be an expert on this, so I'm looking forward to learn about it just as much as everybody else. The first speaker we hope to address that is Besma Mamami, who's a senior fellow at the CIG.
Thank you. So I guess when we were meeting beforehand, we sort of talked about the different viewpoints that we had on the region, and I'm going to be the optimist of the three. So we're going to start you off on a happy note and then slowly bring you down. That's the plan of action. We switch it. It's innovative, new thinking approach is the motto of INET, so we're going to try it this way. I wanted to really get at some of what I think are the big questions that I hear about in terms of what are the Arab Spring and the Arab uprisings. And I'm going to start off with one. Why do we experience the Arab revolutions? And I'm very much sensitive about the kinds of terms that we use. It is a revolution. I think there's something going on in the region today that is unique, it's fascinating, it's very exciting, and it's because of the youth of the region that I think really we need to be optimistic. And for very simple terms, the demographic reality is they will be the majority. And we are looking today where the majority of the population today is at 60% of the population under the age of 35. That's going to just get better and better. And I do think that there's an important role for the youth of the Arab world. And if you're excited about the Arab youth, as I am, you'll see why there's lots of hope for the future. So the Arab youth, I think, were, like we saw on the images on our television screen, really wanting accountable government. They want representative governments. They want to know where their tax dollars are going. The days of sort of preaching to them that, you don't know, leave it to us, the elders, we know what we're doing, just doesn't satisfy them anymore. The Arab world's increasingly educated. Here's another myth that I'm going to bust for you. There are more women in post-secondary education than Arab men. It's not to the image that we have, particularly in the West, about somehow, Afghanistan, where women, don't read and write. Post-secondary education is increasing the most rapidly in the world in the Middle East. Okay, the highest rate of growth in terms of post-secondary education, particularly among women, is in the Arab world. We also know that the Arab world is not only more increasingly educated, they're hyper-connected, and that is a really important part of it. And I don't want to re-emphasize this. It's almost a cliche for those of us who study the Middle East to keep talking about the Twitter revolution, Facebook. It didn't start then. It started with Al Jazeera, it started with satellite television, it started with the whole opening of understanding what's happening out there. And I want to emphasize this because, it used to be kind of easier for leaders in the Middle East to basically get away with, driving their Ferrari in Italy and not being seen. That doesn't happen anymore. The images are loaded in real time. That type of corruption is exposed. And I think that the Arab world increasingly has access not only to the images, but to the philosophy, to the ideas, and they just don't want to accept, I think, the old social contract or the old bargain that they had made with their rulers, which was, you be quiet, we provide to you, and so don't ask for any rights. Increasingly, we have to admit that the neoliberal time of the 1990s, where there were a lot of cutbacks in social welfare and a lot of services, and bringing in that kind of neoliberal economic thinking of basically pull up your bootstraps and fend for yourself, which is great, but that also means that the old social contract of I provide for you and you keep quiet doesn't resonate anymore. And this is across the board. I think one of the things that we have as a myth as well is that somehow in the Gulf countries, which is the biggest sort of state welfare you could think of in terms of the oil sheikhdoms just doling out all these lovely gifts to its citizens, that somehow it's not affecting them. It's affecting them as well. Saudi Arabia has a large population of poor people. Housing crisis in Saudi Arabia is on the rise. All of these, I think, point to frustrations of the masses who say, you know what, again, the old bargain doesn't sit anymore. And not to mention, I think, the kinds of escapism that so many governments in the past had used, i.e. blaming everything from capitalism to, frankly, terms like Americanism and Zionism and colonialism, all the isms, all these structural explanations that for so long the Arab world had depended on to explain the lack of development doesn't resonate anymore. Particularly the young, they're like, I don't buy that. The reason why that I don't have a productive job is not just because of all the isms, it's also because you have also taken from the public purse. There's a reason why you have a Ferrari and traveling around in southern Italy. That is my Ferrari, so to speak. And I think that resonates. And I'm proud of the young Arab people who continue to fight for that dignity. They're fighting for economic productivity. They're fighting for a more prosperous place in their societies. They want a more liberal political and ideological space. And I reject the idea that somehow that can't be married with Islam, because very much it can be. I think it's a new approach of Islam. In fact, one of the things that I'm very proud of the Middle East is how the new young Muslim movements are. I mean, these are, the most passionate preachers nowadays on television, on radio, are increasingly these progressive young preachers who talk about, Islam in terms of love, in terms of, the great advancements of scientific philosophy in Islam, and not just hearkening to the past, but also thinking in terms of progressive ways. So I really think that there's a lot going on to be proud of. So that's why I think the Arab revolutions happened. It was an awakening in so many terms, an awakening because it's basically questioning the basic premise of the social contract. And that's why I'm optimistic. And that takes me to my second question. We need to be optimistic because, again, that's the majority of the population. Look at the demographic map of the Middle East, and you will see that in 20 to 30 years, the sort of old philosophy of those isms and blaming it on a generation of Cold War policies just doesn't resonate anymore. There's a reason why we saw apathy, for example, even I can talk about Egypt in a while, where we saw apathy in the last two referendums of the youth. And there's a reason, because they don't want sort of the same kind of dichotomous narrative of somehow blaming the West and blaming Western powers as always the explanation for things. Third, do we see real change in the Middle East? Absolutely. And it's really in the mindset of the young. If we look at the Arab Barometer, if we look at some of the world or the Arab Values Survey, some of the thinking of the Arab youth is really remarkable and changing quite rapidly. They do have a different approach to what they want to see. They have a different concept of family. We are seeing urbanization at a rapid rate throughout the entire Arab world that didn't exist before. So in the 1950s, when someone in a Jordanian family was expected to marry their cousin, and today they migrated to the city where all those primordial kinds of ascriptive identities of tribe, of sect, all of these are being broken down bit by bit. Now, one of the things that my grandmother, this old, beautiful Jordanian woman, taught me was this wonderful proverb that every day, whenever I get pessimistic about the Middle East, I stop and I say it. And in Arabic, it translates, and if there's any Arabs in the room, it's shara ala shara biyamdu lihya. And it's this idea that if you add a hair to a hair, you get a beard. And it's a wonderful saying because too often we forget about these little things that we see along the way. And you have to remember that you just have to put these little pictures together and you get a very different tableau. And we've too often, I think, focused on so much of the negativity of the region and forgot the essence of what made us, I think, very thrilled to see some of these beautiful young people, for example, taken to Tahrir and to other places in public squares, demanding for more accountable governments. That spirit has gone nowhere. It's there. It's alive and well. Has it hit some bumps along the road? Absolutely. I am not going to deny that there are some serious political challenges. I think there's some serious political challenges in Egypt today. I think there's some serious political challenge in Libya. But even in Libya, and this is the one case that people too often point out and say, well, Libya, look how bad it turned out. I say, no. Libya turned out fine. It could have been Syria. Can we please think about what really could have been the counter-narrative? The counter-narrative could have been 150,000 killed. And Gaddafi was very well willing to do that. The majority of the Libyans today surveyed, 70% are optimistic about the future, think the revolution was worth it by far. This is a country of 7 million people with 2% of the world's oil wealth. There is no reason why this country can't succeed today. There's a lot of promise there. Are there bumps along the road? Yes. But that's not because of the current people in place. That's because Gaddafi did everything to destroy civil society. He did everything to not even have the kind of functioning military that could take over in the national security space. All of those are the people that I think that are really responsible, not the current, I think, government and those who are trying to build their country for the better. Finally, is it over? No. And I think this is really important. I don't want to leave you with this idea that somehow we've entered the Islamist winter. To me, I despise that term. It connotes so much negativity, not only for what I think is a very Orientalist view of the region and somehow assume that Islam cannot be a progressive force. I think it very much can be. But also, it really, I think, undermines the agency of the people in the region. I think that there is a lot of promise, and I think that the region is at the beginning. And history has a long evolution, long time scale here, and I think in 20 years we'll be looking back and looking at what happened in 2010 and 2011 as being the beginning. I see it at the beginning. The conversation of people in the Middle East is different today than it ever was. Again, it's about what are you, the government in the Middle East, going to do for me, the people? That's the beginning of the conversation. People are no longer willing to accept that somehow they need to put their head down and just accept their lot. That is an awakening. That is a beautiful thing for the region, and I very much think it's a revolution. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Neslan. Next speaker is Mustafa Nabli, the former governor of the Central Bank of Tunisia, and tells me he's going to talk about the current situation as well, and also related to the history of the region. And he's been billed as part optimistic, part pessimistic, so we shall see.
I'm not going to talk about the why and this has happened and so on. I'm trying to describe really the main. I'm trying to think a little bit about what's new, what's different, what has happened in terms and not why it happened and so on, because that's a long story. So looking back, I have been thinking about it and looking over the last century or so and what kind of revolutions and uprisings have been happening in the region and so on. And broadly speaking, there have been a lot of uprisings over the last century or so, century and a half in the region. Some of them even called revolutions. And all kinds from those, from the early 20th century and the Arab revolt of 1916, 1918, to the revolutions and uprisings against the colonial powers, and the uprisings against the governments over the last 50 years and so on. So lots of things have been happening. So what I thought was really new and different is that what has happened in 2011 brings together 5 main features which we have never seen before together. They're different. And that's really what's new and different. First, we have seen these events were sudden and unexpected uprisings. It's not the first time that happens. It happens in some other cases. But these were sudden and unexpected. And they were, unlike many cases before, uniquely popular. They were not organized. They had no leadership, no organization, no individuals, no ideological background. This is second characteristic, which was extremely important to put together. And the third is the contagion effect. Contagion effect means that the uprisings were very quickly spread from one country to the other, at least for a few countries. And at least 6 countries were heavily, strongly influenced, but even the others were influenced in many different ways, not so strongly. The third and the fourth characteristic or feature is that in many cases, and this was unprecedented as well, they led to a quick and precipitous collapse of many existing regimes. Regimes which would have been very difficult just a few days before or a few weeks before to think they would have collapsed so quickly. And we had at least 4 countries where the collapse was very quick and abrupt. In Tunisia, clearly Egypt, and Jordan and Yemen, not so quick, but as well happened. But eventually in Libya, it took a war, and in Syria as well. But at least 4 countries, there was a major and very quick change in the political regimes following that. The fifth feature is that the demands were clear of the youth. That's what I was talking about. Especially the youth were driving these uprisings. But on the other hand, they were broad. They were not very specific. They were talking about bread, about dignity, about freedom, about against corruption and things like that. So they were very broad principles. They're not asking for specific things. Like in many cases before, like there were many uprisings where people are asking for, lower prices of bread and protesting against increasing price of bread or increasing price of gasoline or this. In this case, the demands were very clear, very obvious, but they were very broad in character. Now, why I'm saying this, these are 5 features which together are a new phenomenon. We have never seen this happen before. So in this sense, in many ways, these uprisings are not history repeating itself. They are new. They are fundamentally new development. They are an innovation in the social and political realm of the region as well. The question is, what about the implications? What happened afterwards? Because what I have been talking about is the few months, the first semester of 2011, say, 3 to 6 months of 2011. Now the question is what happened afterwards. Is the follow-up, is what happened in the evolution of events afterwards any different from what had been expected? Now here, I would say that my main message is that I would like to distinguish between the medium term and the long term implications. My message or my hypothesis or whatever you call it is that sadly enough, the events which have unfolded since the uprisings would strongly, as of now, as of what we know today, after 3 years, would point to some to an outcome that is similar to many other cases in history. It means that the Arab uprisings are not going to lead soon to open and democratic societies or to more equitable development in the Middle East. So I'm pessimistic on that front. On the other hand, my other message is that when we look at a deeper level, the recent uprisings have the potential to drastically change the future of the region in the long run. So I'm relatively pessimistic in the medium term, short and medium term, and I'm optimistic for the long term. And let me explain why. So this is the gray hair that I'm bringing to the... So let's talk about the transition, the medium term, short to medium term. I think the short to medium term transition has run into 4 or 5 major challenges, which have made it messy, costly, and is likely to lead to unwelcome outcomes in the medium term. The first challenge is the standard counter-revolutionary pressures that would come from any movement like this. The groups that were benefiting from the old system were eventually going to act and react and will try either to slow down or to reverse the process. And we have seen this in different degrees, different ways in the different countries. But these are certainly there, and the most obvious case is the Syria case, where very quickly the regime reacted and fought back and has been pushing back. But we see this in other cases as well. We see it in Libya, we see it in somewhat in Egypt, we see it in a strong way in Yemen, and we see some of it in Tunisia as well. So this is making the process difficult and messy. The second challenge is also a standard one, and which we have seen in standard democratic transitions, where because of the very nature of what I talked about in terms of 5 features, makes these events difficult to work out. Democratic transitions lead to various groups trying to shape the new rules, because essentially you break the old rules and you want to establish a new system and you want to agree on new rules, whether through constitutional process, through rules of the game in terms of social behaviors and so on. But getting to agree on new rules is nothing that is easy. And we have seen fights over these new rules. And this is leading to a lot of strains and tensions in the political and social domain. And this is making the transition very difficult. The third part of the challenges is the economic risks. We have been seeing economic risks increase because the very nature of the events, the uprisings, had a negative impact initially on the economy, and this eventually translated in a number of problems, pressures on the fiscal situation, on in some cases on the banking systems, lower growth, higher unemployment, increase in poverty. All of those things make the transition more difficult. And what I'm more concerned about is the interaction about the first 3, about the economic risks, economic difficulties, the tensions in the political process, the counter-revolutionary forces, and this make a mixture and feedback loops which might be undermining the process at a very deep level. So these are 3 major events which are. So the first 3 problems are standard. We have seen them in most political transitions and so on. What is new, what is different in the case of the Arab uprisings is that we have seen very quickly the emergence of polarization, social polarization, which has translated political polarization against the role of religion and religious groups in the political process. This is a long outstanding problem which dates back to century and a half, which have come back to the fore, which is the fight between the secular forces and the traditional conservative religious forces. And this has come to in many ways, to the top of the agenda. We have seen it in Egypt, we have seen it in Tunisia in the most pure form, if you like, but it's present as well in Libya, it is present in Yemen, it is certainly present in Syria. And this made the transition extremely complex and even more difficult and more costly and messy. And I don't want to talk too much about the fifth challenge, which is the external interference. In all cases, especially in the Middle East, in Syria, there are a lot of external interference from the different powers that have an interest in this. So all of this together, all of these challenges are making and will make the transition difficult. And so moving into a situation where we're going to have stable democratic regimes in the medium, in the short, medium run is going to be very difficult. We're going to go through a very difficult process of difficult economic conditions, difficult, unstable political system, unstable social problems, and so on. So the short to medium term is messy, is going to be costly, and we have not seen the end of it now. However, the same features, the same 5 features, which to a large extent are the cause of this, because the reason we have many of these things didn't work themselves out clearly, it's because of the nature of the uprisings. The fact there was no leadership, there was no clear agenda, made this possible to happen, and did not allow for a smoother transition, a better transition in some ways. So on the other hand, what I would like to make is that the same feature and the same events that have been happening that are making the transition difficult have in themselves the seeds of a potential major change in the future of the region. And let me try to explain this, and this may be not sufficiently understood. I think there are 4 major things which have been happening, which are fundamental for the future of the region, and they are working themselves. The first is now we have a credible threat, given the experience of the uprising, that against any non-accountable and autocratic government in the future. It has been proven that the people are able to undertake on their own and rise against unaccountable and autocratic regimes. And this is, rulers have to learn this, have learned this, and they will always remember that. The second thing is that we have seen in action, as well as in the polls, but also in what people are doing on the streets, the preference of the populations of the Arab world for democracy has been amply tested and accepted, and even though it may weaken temporarily, but it is strong. And the idea that some have been expanding, that some exceptionalism of the Arab world has been completely now discounted and forgotten. This is a major thing that we have to keep. The third thing is that for the first time in the history of the region, an open and profound debate is taking place between the secularists and the Islamists. This debate has started about a century and a half ago, but it has never played itself in the open, in a democratic process. But it is taking place now, in different ways, sometimes messy ways, but this debate is taking place, and this debate is really, for me, is at the source of the political evolution of the last century, and it has been driving that. And this debate is taking place, and it's working itself out in the open for the first time in the history of the region. The fourth event, which is fourth feature, or the fourth component of the argument, is that the Islamist ideology, which has pretended all along for a century or so that it holds the solution for the region's problems, has had this time the opportunity to be tested on the ground. And it has been found wanting. It has not delivered. And this is going to push the Islamist politicians or Islamist groups to rethink their way of engaging society and engaging with the rest of society. And this is the basis for any future democratic process to take root in the region. So these four features, or these four evolutions, if you like, are extremely important in terms of trying to work out the implications of what has been happening for the future. And therefore, my conclusion is that we are in for a rough ride. It's difficult, it's messy, it's going to be difficult over the coming period. It's not linear, but I think we are seeing the seeds of a potential rooting democracy rooting itself in the region in a profound way, and the process working itself out in a positive way. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Very interesting talk. Our final panelist is Sandra Halperin, who's a professor of international relations at the University of London. And she tells me she's going to take the big picture approach.
I'm very happy to have been invited to participate in this conference. My area of expertise is what might be described as historical sociology of global development. So I feel somewhat like a fish out of water here. But that involves looking at the development of all regions in association with each other. And on the basis of a great deal of recent research and writing by specialists of specific regions of the world, but also of world and global historians, which is forcing a real rethinking of standard historical narratives. And in that way, perhaps, I can make a modest contribution to new economic thinking by confronting some of the profound myths that pass as historical, the historical record on which much of current economic thinking, and particularly thinking about development, is based. So I want to engage with two elements of this panel. First of all, with the program material that references perhaps the fruitfulness of comparison between European revolutions and contemporary recent events in the contemporary Middle East, which I'm happy to reflect on, in as much as the Middle East and Europe are the two regions of the world that have the most in common with each other, more than any other regions of the world. And that's unsurprising, because much of what we think of as European actually didn't originate in Europe at all, but came from the Middle East. And even when it was adopted in Europe rather late in the story of modern development, modern global development, it wasn't really a dominant feature of European experience. So it's not surprising that there are some commonalities and comparisons that might be fruitfully made, and so I'll be speaking in comparative terms. And also I'm happy to engage with the theme of revolution and recurrence. And certainly students of history are very often aware of the fact that things that have occurred in the past tend to recur. Of course, technological advance means that we're never in exactly the same world, but because there are sort of social logics, processes in social life that recur, we're never an entirely different one. So I have to give this pitch to my students. I teach a year-long course on the Middle East, and I start back with Persia and Byzantium and the birth of Islam, which I see as the birth of modernity, and they have to spend a full semester before we even reach the 20th century. But I'm not going to do that today, although I want to talk about recurrence and repetition and revolution. And I was looking for pictures for a lecture on the Arab Spring, and I came across this, and it sort of rang a bell. It looked awfully familiar to me. And then I went looking through my teaching files and found another slide on a PowerPoint that I'd used earlier in the semester, and it looked like this. Maybe I can toggle that back and forth. You see, it's really quite eerily similar. No, I'm not getting it back and forth. Eerily similar to, in terms of substance and composition, even of course the military equipment is the same. And this last one is from 2011 in Egypt. And this other one, of course, is 1952 in Egypt. And I found it sort of startlingly similar. You know, the same sort of, the lone young person throwing something at that cordon of public servants. And, but I also found really poignant the caption, Al-Thawra al-Misriya Kadima, the Egyptian revolution is coming. And poignant in terms of the decades that followed this revolution, the subsequent decades. And also poignant in terms of the hopes and expectations of activists and observers of recent events in the region. And I think those hopes are really linked to perhaps the hope that something's been set in motion that's going to lead to real, durable, transformative change. Not just in terms of greater freedom, but in terms of a government that can bring about a really profound change in the circumstances of life for the masses. And so I want to sort of stand back a little bit and look at what it is that brings about transformative change. And here some socioeconomic history might help us to see what it is that has brought about transformative change and what it is that has just inaugurated a long process of counter-revolution. Let's see, I guess this image is what I was sort of after. I was looking at all of the certainly all of the discussion and debate from abroad, from outside of the region, that focused on the departure of these heads of state. But I had to ask the question as a student of history and of global political economy, of whether the weeds, the top of the weeds had been pulled out, leaving these roots in place. And I guess that really goes to the heart of what I want to get at here, that regime changes sometimes change the faces in the capital city, and sometimes those faces are somewhat familiar, but they change clothes from military to civilian clothes. But that there are very, very durable structures that remain. And again, I've been haunted by 1952 as well. So I want to get to, without really imposing any kind of pessimistic overarching view here, I just want to explore what it is that brings about the kind of transformative change that I think hopes and expectations are linked to. And that's what I want to talk about, those roots and how deeply entrenched and extensive they are, and some of the political economic structures that have been developing over a very long time that are still perhaps there untouched and may remain untouched. And I suppose since I started with 1952 and then this, the events recently in the Middle East, I probably should take a moment just to respond to Mustafa Nobly, who is now giving me quite a difficult task in trying to make this kind of comparison or linkage between the past and the present. And he said, well, recent events were very sudden and unexpected. And I thought that what really drew me into the study of the Middle East was I happened to wander into a room and see the Iranian Revolution on television. Of course, I was an infant, but not really. But it was really an extraordinary thing to see people in the street making and remaking their own history. And what really began to capture my interest in the days and weeks and months that followed is how very sudden and unexpected it seemed. All the intelligence services and all of the people in academia, in which I eventually signed on to in order to study Iran and the Iranian Revolution, all of the conflict researchers, except for a few Aramco officials that began leaving in '78. It seemed very sudden and unexpected, as did the seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca following that, which was much less publicized, but really sent shock waves through the halls of power, and many other things that followed. And then the notion that that this was a popular uprising with no leaders. I think that's really interesting, because in '52, those masses in the street, those 1 million people in the streets of Cairo were very well organized. There were peasant associations and student associations and unions and the Communist Party and socialist parties and syndicalist movements, et cetera, et cetera. But there is something that's fallen under the radar screen again in Egypt, as it did perhaps in Iran, which is all those medium and small violent conflict events that people don't seem to follow with great attention. And it seems that there has been a lot of union organizing, and particularly a whole spate of uprisings and real activism in the textile sector in particular, which I find very positive. But I still think it's an interesting point. And then the point about a contagion. Well, I think the idea of coup contagion in the social sciences actually came from the Middle East. If you can recall all those coups in Syria and coups and then the revolutions of the 1950s, I think we have seen this kind of contagious effect. And then the quick collapse of regimes. Well, again, looking at this picture, these regimes have collapsed. But again, I'm asking about what are the roots of these people's power? And have these regime changes gotten to those roots? And I think that the events in 1952 also were very broad social demands. This was that classic fusion, as in Europe and other regions, of nationalist demands, Egypt for the Egyptians and the British out. But that totally merged with a sense that British and Egyptian elites were part of the same imperium, which I think was absolutely true. And that nationalism is often the banner under which a social revolution is pursued. So, okay, I'll leave that behind for a moment and then say something about why I'm broadly concerned about whether what's happening in the region has gotten to these roots. And so I want to talk about worldwide revolutions, which is what we're supposed to engage with here, or at least it challenges someone with my background to engage with it. And I wanted to think of some kind of worldwide revolution and what it really represented, how it got inscribed in history, and how we invoke it today, and how we use it as a comparative focus for understanding the potentialities of revolutionary uprisings that we've seen, as for instance recently in the Middle East. So I thought about a global revolution, which is, as someone remarked contemporaneously, an event in the human mind, which was a global revolution, which we call the French Revolution, that precipitated a global war and really changed very little. Obviously, there was a restoration in France, there was reaction almost everywhere else, and it set in train a century of counter-revolution. Because though it changed very little, obviously the political structure of Europe changed, but not its social structure, which I think is part of the real story of the Middle East since the demise of the Ottoman Empire. A change in political structure, but structures consolidated under hundreds of years of Ottoman rule were left undisturbed in many crucial ways. But what the French Revolution did was to inspire a deathly fear in what was an increasingly interconnected global elite, a fear of revolution. And so there really was 100 years of revolution. And I wanted to say that the counter-revolution is what we have wrongfully called, not a revolution at all, but the Industrial Revolution, a phrase that was retroactively applied to that time, and historians at the time objected strenuously that that was a profound misstatement and misrepresentation of what had happened. All the technology of the Industrial Revolution really was associated with the 16th century. There was large-scale industrial mechanized manufacturing in Europe and Asia at the time. But what it was is something that will sound eerily familiar to you as we're exploring revolution and recurrence. And that was a counter-revolution which involved an economic reorganization. That was the deregulation of markets and capital, the end of the national welfare systems and moral economies that had characterized a number of countries in Europe and also elsewhere in Afro-Eurasia, the deindustrialization of rural areas and concentration of production in what today we call global cities and city regions. And what these policies together did was to enable Europeans to launch a brutal expansion of production for export that became a model for elites and ruling groups throughout the world. And the reason for this is something that elites expressed in a lot of the literature at the time, and particularly the economists in their journalistic literature picked up this discourse, not only in Europe but in Asia, about having to halt the democratization of consumption. And if elites were going to get wealthy by industrially producing goods and services, it better be for people who are not local, for settler communities elsewhere, for governments, ruling groups. Let it be railroads and armaments and telegraphs and docks, things that governments can buy. Okay, and in fact, that's exactly the model, what a dependency theorists call, idiosyncratic contemporary third world development, that became the model in Britain, in Europe, and all over the world. Obviously, the City of London was like the advanced sector of a dependent third world economy, building strong linkages between British export industries and foreign economies rather than integrating the local economy. And consequently, on the eve of the World Wars, Britain was described as consisting of small islands of luxury and ostentation surrounded by a sea of mass poverty and misery. The upshot of all that is that developmental trajectories around the globe were very similar. So what we should be asking is what changed and why in some very restricted parts of the world, and what didn't change in places like the Middle East. Well, what changed and what became the developed world were those that experienced a social revolution in the course of the world wars. That is a mobilization of the masses to fight those wars and a mobilization of workers for the industry to support that. And there was a social revolution that shifted social power in Europe and a few other countries that made restoration and reaction impossible, whether under labor governments or conservative governments. And that was, for a time, a real social revolution. Social revolution was also engineered by the US in vulnerable East Asian countries, in which there was a radical transformation of structures, radical agrarian reform, legislation that governed investment by multinationals, et cetera, et cetera. But those measures were never promoted or advocated in any other part of the world other than those countries that were frontline countries in the geostrategic encirclement of the Soviet Union. Instead, what was promoted and what has continued to be promoted today are policies that are just the opposite of what brought about phenomenal prosperity and a stable democracy in the so-called developed world. First of all, there was the Cold War that eradicated all those forces in the Middle East that in other regions were at the vanguard of movements for broad-based development and democratization, not only communists and socialists, but any group, center or slightly right of center, that called for land reform or the sorts of reforms that we associate with broad-based dynamic development and greater freedoms. And then when we look at all the sorts of things that the world wars inaugurated in the so-called developed world, the growth of the power of working classes relative to that of other classes, relatively more nationally embedded capital, the development of purchasing power among a mass domestic citizen workforce that makes possible new mass consumer goods industries and the extension and integration of domestic markets, policies designed to increase domestic investment, a more equitable distribution of income, welfare policies that had been dismantled in Europe in the 19th century and then resumed after 1945. None of these features are prominent in the vast literature devoted to development and the requisites of democracy. nor are they outcomes envisioned by the initiatives promoted by Western governments, NGOs, and international organizations. So, okay, something can change, right? We're all moving now to a global developed world, but no, I think not. I think that starting in the 70s, that part of the world that we call the developed world began to roll back the changes that had been put in place after World War II, the Second World as well, so that rather than the Third World becoming more integrated to a global First World, we're seeing just the opposite. We're seeing the developed world, both the First and Second World, sort of rolling back and assuming the same structures that before the World Wars were part of the historical normal pattern of capitalist development. So that I think as time goes by, we are going to see the 1950s and 1960s as a kind of brief interregnum, 2 or 3 decades in which social revolutionary changes in a few areas of the world tied capital to the expansion and integration of national markets, and suspended the operation of historically normal patterns of capitalist social reproduction. And so this is a broad picture that leads me to, if not be pessimistic, to be a little bit more cautionary than my fellow panelists. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thanks to an accident of history, one of the panelists didn't turn up. We've actually got quite a lot of time for discussion, which is good. Try and get some audience interaction. I'll just start it off with a couple of questions to the panel, but please try and come up with some questions, and after we do I'll do a couple and then hand it over to you guys. First of all, let me just play devil's advocate here. I mean, Sandra says she was pessimistic. If I was going to be a pessimist, I'd say, you know, the Arab Spring was great, but maybe it is the Arab winter. Let's just go through the countries. Egypt looks like we're going to have a plebiscitary dictatorship after another couple of weeks. Syria, we've got a civil war with the existing regime basically cracking heads and winning, it looks like. Yemen, we've got a regime which is also still pretty oppressive, propped up by the Americans with drones, etc. Iraq, we've got a sectarian sort of democracy, which isn't anything like what we hoped we'd see 5 years ago. I understand there's more, you know, there are some more hopeful signs, but they're the big countries. What is left of the Arab Spring?
So I'm not disputing all of the challenges that exist, and I'm not saying that there aren't enormous amount of work to be done. But let me give you the one country that, you know, if there's in need of a cultural revolution like any other, is Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia is the outlier in the entire Middle East in the sense that it's draconian, it lives in medieval times, there's a lot to be done. What does it mean when we have thousands and thousands of Saudi students sent to the West to study and are going back in droves to their home country? That's a phenomenon. That's one of the little hairs I'm talking about. That is going to shake up the ruling family more so than the end of oil. You have the masses of students we have in Canada alone, something in the order of 20,000 students, I heard at one point, that have graduated from this country. Similar in the United States, in all fields, are going back to their country and saying, wait a minute, I have the requisite knowledge, I have the pedigree. You know, you can't tell me that you, maybe in the 70s it was, you know, exclusive to one group and one family that went to elite universities. That's no more. That is a social revolution awaiting. And that's one of the biggest countries I think that needs enormous amount of reform. And I am seeing that today, questioning Saudi men. You know, I mean, if anybody's been watching the Twitter sphere, you know, Saudi men making YouTube videos, songs, saying, I want my wife to drive. My point is, this is something that we can't ignore it and say, okay, but you know, there's a bunch of geriatrics in power in Saudi Arabia. Yes, there are. There are geriatrics in power, and yes, that needs to change. But something is happening at the base that we cannot ignore, because then we'll have exactly what Sandra pointed out. One day we all will wake up and say, wait, nothing, where did that happen? It's happening now. The revolution is happening throughout the entire Middle East. And I think that if you look and see the stories of all of these vignettes of different people in the region, you wouldn't be as pessimistic. And I'm not by any means, I mean, for all of those Saudis who have to live under this repressive autocratic regime, kudos to them, but they are literally taking up the challenge every day to go on Twitter, to go online, to challenge themselves, getting in their cars. The other day, there was, about a week ago, women got into their cars and against defiance of the ban against women's driving, which is, again, archaic. That, to me, says something. And again, I am not suggesting that it's not hard and difficult, but I'm saying that there's something there that's happening and bubbling to the surface. And one day, by sheer demographics, I'm saying the top heaviness will be the majority of the population. That'll be youth, and they are not going to put up with the old-fashioned ways of politics and society.
Mustafa, what do you think? You've pointed to 4 factors which have positive potential. So the credible threat of uprisings against corrupt governments, is still there. Pressure for democracy remains strong. There's a secular and Islamic debate, and the Islamic ideology is being tested and found honest, referring to Egypt. Just looking at the headlines and the pictures we see, it seems very pessimistic, not just witnesses. Could you perhaps and give us a bit of the Tunisian perspective, because obviously Tunisia is one of the hopeful places.
Well, I tried exactly to deal with that kind of contradiction. Seems when you look at the news today, when you look at how things are happening, you cannot be optimistic. And there is something to it. And that's what I'm saying, that the short and medium term is going to be very, very difficult. And it's not good. But at the same time, there are fundamental things happening. And here, I would like to come to Sandra's point about the roots and the social economic foundations of the old regimes. And actually, I didn't talk about it here because I didn't have time, but I have written about it somewhere else. The economic and social model that has been prevailing for the last 50 years was not sustainable anymore. Okay? No, I mean it is not, and I have a long paper on this and trying to explain why we have been following the evolution of the last 50, 60 years of the authoritarian bargain and so on, and then talking about the predictability of what has happening and so on. I explain this in the following way. My explanation of the dynamic is that by the early 2000s, the oil system was not sustainable anymore. It was vulnerable because it was not able to deliver anymore on the bargain. And therefore, the oil coalition collapsed. And therefore, the social and economic foundation, the roots of these regimes is not there anymore. So that's what makes me optimistic, if you like, because not only so what I was trying to add here is that the social economic conditions are not there anymore for these autocratic regimes to sustain themselves, but also the overall political and cultural climate is changing, which is going to sustain a new direction.
So we'll have a period of counter-revolution, but that's still got internal contradictions.
It's still working itself out. It's not finished. Now, a final comment on Sandra, maybe I didn't explain it. When I talked about the 5 features, the first time we see them together in this combination. We have seen any one of them at different points in time. Even the uprisings, the 1988 revolution of Algeria was very similar to what happened in Tunisia in 2011 or in Egypt. But then the rest was not. We didn't have all the other features. So what I'm saying that that constellation of features, of factors, is unique. What did not happen. Even the Iranian Revolution did not have that.
Sandra, do you have anything?
Yeah, just a short intervention first about the old model. I'm sorry. About the old model. I think what I've been referencing, and you'll have to correct me because it is that the model that seems to be historically normal is what we call neoliberalism today. And that's back with a vengeance. And not only through structural adjustment, but post-conflict reconstructions, post-tsunami and disaster reconstructions, democratization, good governance initiatives. They're all the same policy prescription. And they're very aggressively being promoted. And they're exactly the opposite of what historically broadened participation in economies and polities. in Asian tigers, Japan, parts of Europe, et cetera, et cetera. They are the absolutely opposite prescription. Just a second point, but if I know we're being filmed, are we going to be posted on the internet? Because then I won't say this.
I think things will be on the internet. Yeah.
All right, I wanted to say something about Saudi students, something I know quite well from personal experience, but I'll forgo that.
Okay. Just one more. Basma wants to reply to that. I want to ask a question about whether there's a Middle Eastern economic model, but Basma would.
Well, I mean, that ties into it. One of the things that is, I think, a partial explanation, and I've done some research on this, so if I may apologize for hogging this, but, one of the things that happened during the Arab revolutions was the excess amount of money invested in real estate. If we're going to link this to the global financial issues, in 2003 to 2008, we had an oil boom. And that meant, we saw oil prices go all the way up to $140 a barrel. Now, a lot of that money, capital surplus, particularly from the oil-rich countries, found its way into neighboring Middle East countries. And what did they want to build? They built towers, they built malls, they built resort villages, they built amusement parks. Literally, this was their top priority. And the reason why, as investors, they know how to build towers. It's a Dubai model. That's what they do. But actually, what it did in the Arab world was create, in fact, more social problems. Because now what you have are malls with young people who we already said are educated, unemployed, know what Gucci and what these brands are, and are walking around. You can go to Egypt City Stars, you can go to Mecca Mall in Amman, you can go to Solitaire in Lebanon, and they are these wonderful marvels of modernization. They're beautiful, they're spectacular. But when the people in the majority of the population can't enjoy them, you create problems. And you create problems because people themselves are being told that, look, we're modernizing. So you had Suzanne Mubarak talk about these modernizations in terms of these towers, and you had people toting around these great investments into malls as somehow that's development. That's not development. That does not create jobs. And unfortunately, if we're talking about where the economic model and new thinking had to be, what we needed was responsible governments in the Arab world at that time, who when an investor came and saw something, they had to ask the question, how many jobs will I get out of that? We didn't have that, unfortunately. It was like, wow, I'm going to have a bigger tower than Dubai. Bring it on. That's not the way that we should be doing development. And unfortunately, that's the mindset of, frankly, a dictator. A dictator loves to have these big, shiny things in his country so that when Westerners come to visit him or her, usually a him, they see these lovely, shiny towers and think that's progress. That's not progress, my friends, and that's one of the the thinkings that didn't get to the leaders, but yet the young people understood was problematic at its best. And so that I think is something that is another issue to link to the global economy and the financial models.
That's great. Mustafa, I want to ask you about this economic question. There used to be this attitude in the West, which I think was sort of thinly disguised racism, basically David Landers and people saying that there was something sort of fundamentally antithetical between Islam and modern economic development because of the usury laws, etc. That always struck me as being sort of absurd. And some countries, I understand, I'm not an expert on this, but Tunisia has always given us an example of actually done pretty well trying to turn themselves into a manufacturing hub for southern Europe. I understand there's people moving in their computer companies, etc. Is there a sort of model there which the rest of the region can try and copy? Obviously, we've got the elites problem, you've got the sort of resource curse in some of these countries with everybody's just fighting over who's going to get the oil wealth. Is there a sort of viable North African model that we can look to?
Wow, that's should have 3 days for that. 3 days or so. Now, on the Islam and development and so on, I think this is all of the research that I have seen and all of things, once you account for the other characteristics, the fundamentals, the role of Islam and Islamic nature is relevant for growth and for development of the region. So that's really a no problem. Now the real question is, what to do going forward? What kind of development model? And I said again, I don't like that word, economic model and development model. I don't know what it means exactly, but what is it that needs to be done going forward? And clearly there is not the same thing. The region is very diverse. I used to say there are at least 4 types of countries, and everyone is going to be different. There are the rich countries which have the resource-rich countries, which have low populations and they are not very labor abundant, and there are the resource-rich which are labor abundant, like Algeria, like Iraq, like Yemen, and there are the others, and the poor, not resources, and they're poor,
Right.
and there are those, and everyone is going to be different. However, we know. I mean, I don't know. Sandra is really, questioning the whole approach of development and what kind of approach is best, whether the neoliberal and the kind of programs that we have been talking about is really
Right.
the way forward or not. And that's really an open question that needs a lot of time to be discussed. And I don't think we can discuss it in a short period of time.
Okay. Do you have anything to say now, Sandra?
I would just follow up on that, and yes, this is too long a discussion for getting into this panel. The idea of Islam or the Arab world being somehow in some way antithetical to capitalist development is kind of an audacious claim, because so much of what we think of as the European economic miracle is just basically glommed onto practices that were developed by Muslim communities around the Indian Ocean. But putting that all aside, the fact is that any country can export anything. Canada and the US exported raw materials, and then they took the revenues and they sunk them into diversifying the economy. The social structure allowed for that. The balance between industrial elites and landowning elites was settled in the US through a bloody war, et cetera, et cetera. So there's nothing to prevent elites from taking whatever the revenues are from oil and everything else and deciding to invest it in something that will bring about broad-based, inclusive, sustainable, dynamic, durable prosperity and development. That's not done. Why isn't it done? Well, if you look through history, it's very, very rare to find people who are living well and doing well and supported by elites elsewhere. And elites always support each other because they're few and vulnerable. They need each other. Decide to walk away and say, well, I've had a good run. I think I'll go home and get a day job. So if the Egyptian military controls 40% of the Egyptian economy, this is a military that's at war with nobody and gets $1.3 billion US of aid each year to become a business conglomerate. What is it that forces them to say, well, we had a good run, let's just use this money in more productive ways for broad-based? I don't see it in history where people walk away from that, particularly when the US is really keen to use my tax dollars to pay for the military aid that will keep US defense industries humming. So it's a virtuous circle, just like the oil, So again, the roots are very extensive. It goes into the global economy, and it impacts many other economies that have no real interest in promoting real dynamic, inclusive growth, real democracy.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to turn over to the audience and chat there. Can you, can you just stand up and identify yourself? And
Yes, my name is Steve. I'd like to talk a little bit more about Saudi Arabia. So there wasn't a revolution there because the regime just pumped billions of dollars back in welfare payments to the society and was able to buy itself off. And it's totally dependent on oil being well above $80 a barrel. But you also have an economy where it's based on immigrants, or actually guest workers there, so nobody, no Saudis really works. That is, of course, unstable. It's going to come to an end. And the only question is when.
okay, that's not very optimistic. Anybody else? Chat next.
Ryan Hudson. I was just wondering, this is where Sandra is going, but are we characterizing, or maybe not us, but the popular media is characterizing this in a liberal way when we should be maybe drawing more on conflict theory or Marxist theory? Is this given that we've gone through a kind of 30-year period of neoliberal capitalism, is this a peripheral expression of inequality or class conflict? Instead of characterizing it as liberal terms around desires for freedom and self-expression, protesting and hopefully have many issues. I don't know, is it more an economic conflict or bread
Anybody like to address that?
Well, I think that we have to think about the timing. I'm sorry, we have to think about the timing. Why now? I mean, it might be interesting to hear from all the panelists about what it was about 2011 that began this series of events. And when I went looking for it, I saw the just doubling down in Tunisia and elsewhere of neoliberal policies that was exacerbating this dualism of what Besma just described, of the 7-star hotels and the extraordinary, not third world poverty, but fourth world poverty, and that is exactly the opposite prescription. Those policies, neoliberalism, is just the opposite of what knit together real national economies. So I think it was, and maybe Mustafa has a different view of this, but I think...
Certainly.
I can turn over the stage to you.
No, I mean, why 2011? I mean, it's certainly not because there is any change in the dominant policies, whether it's neoliberal. There's nothing. I mean, the policies in Tunisia, broadly speaking, they have not changed for the, last 20 or 30 years. So it's nothing different. However, I have written, my explanation is that what happened, the triggers that made it happen are 2 or 3 very specific ones. One is the unemployment of university graduates. There has been, over the last 10 years, before 2011, multiplication by 6 of the unemployment rates of university graduates. Now, we have to talk about why this is so and so on. It's not really, whether it is due to these policies or not, and what are the education policies and so on. So that's one. The second is the huge, dramatic increase in corruption, visible corruption. Well, so it's not, no, I don't think so. It's not linked. It's the way the power was captured by this small elite, the family groups, and so on, which was against, actually, it's worse than crony capitalism. And it's not neoliberal. I think it's anti-neoliberalism. Actually, it was predation against the capitalist system. So it is. That's the major second, event that the third feature is the increasing. And I think that's common between Egypt and it's the succession problem. It's the political succession problem, which is really was coming to a head. Tunisia, it's not only in Egypt. It was in Tunisia, it was in Egypt, it was in Libya. It was how is the sections going to be taking place, and who is going to succeed? It's these things which came together.
Thank you, the man at the back.
As you were talking about the 7-star hotels and the Dubai bloc of capitalism, it brought to mind an image that I saw a few months ago of the house in Mumbai built by Anil Ambani, which is a 27-story billion-dollar house.
Can you speak up or use a microphone?
Take a microphone, please.
When I was in Mumbai a few months ago, I was able to see the house that was built by Anil Ambani, which is a 27-story billion-dollar house, and it's built in one of the poorest areas of Mumbai. And that's the image that came to mind as you were talking about the Dubai model of capitalism and the 7-star hotels. And do you think, and that's just very symbolic about the duality of growth in India, which is that you have the growths have been incredibly unequal. And there's been a rising amount of civil unrest in India recently, especially when you consider that there's a party that's been probably the most left-wing party that India's seen in a long time that's taken hold of the capital city of Delhi. They're called the Aam Aadmi Party. I was wondering how you see that evolving over the next few months.
Anybody want to tackle that one?
I think Basma has written about, how the IMF is trying to, filter in some concerns about inequality and all of that. But what you describe and what's being described by Basma and everyone, many of you, is this, what dependency theory is called dualism. So it's a very restricted enclave, which is utterly foreign-oriented, has no impact on, very little impact on the rest of it. This, as I said, was how capitalism developed right from the start. That was the model that was developed in Britain and Europe and exported elsewhere. You know, there wasn't any metropole and periphery in that respect. That was suspended for a couple of decades after World War II through some Keynesian social democratic compromises that were forced because of the strength of labor. And elites were watching in the Middle East and elsewhere, and that's why they have these barracks of workers in the Gulf who, if they want to bid up their wages, they're put on a plane and they fly home, rather than a citizen workforce. That's, as I said, I think the 50s and 60s was a blip. That was a social revolution, and neoliberalism, again, is a counter-revolution. With the deregulation and freeing capital from national polities and society, that's the recurring phenomenon. And that's why I'm a little pessimistic, because I don't see what it is that opens that up to transformative change. And, you know, I'd love somebody to talk me down and tell me.
I think Besma's going to come in.
You know, I think one of the things that frustrates me when we revert to the isms right away, it's not capitalism. It's the people who are in charge, it's accountable governments, because the governments have a choice here. So rather than, for example, in Egypt building a super fast road to get people to the beaches of their mansions on the north coast, they should be focusing on improving the metro for the populace. There's a decision being made. When, you know, governments are choosing to allow another mall to be built as opposed to updating the infrastructure in electricity, the grids, in terms, that's an elected choice that governments make. My point is that governments who are not accountable to their people, who frankly don't care because they assume that they have this God-given right to be in power, don't question whether or not this is going to create jobs. And what we need are governments in the Middle East to take every project that comes into the country and ask the one question should be, does this create jobs? Is this inclusive growth? And unfortunately, I think for too long, many governments of the region just resonated to say, well, I'm going to build what I want. And that often was very much right to the top. We had a lot of micromanaging at the very elite level where people wanted to create these really, what they, I think, are false symbols of modernization, shiny and new, but didn't necessarily feed the people. And I think there's a lot of ideas out there on what needs to be done. So there's no shortage. It's a matter of commitment. It's a matter of, do they feel responsible and accountable to their people? And I have to say, I'm not suggesting that the revolutions by any means were about democracy, because that's a very liberal connotation that we brought to the game. But I do believe that truly democratic countries do in fact have a higher ability to be responsible about the public purse. And so I think there is need and room for democracy in many of these countries.
So active participation would be the primary recourse for change.
I mean, public participation in economic development, if that's what you're saying, absolutely. But I think also we need to also change the, I mean, in some way the popular pressure hasn't meant that if they want to be there for the next, you know, how many years they think their role gives them, they need to start thinking about jobs. They need to start providing jobs for the people, because I think that's in the essence what people want. It's productive economic work and increasingly meritocracy, because they are educated and they're not going to accept, you know, underemployment, which is a real prevalent problem in the region as well.
Chap in the side there, yeah.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the panel very much. Thank you. It's comments and questions, because you give either pessimistic or optimistic. But actually, this shows the difficult to imagine a real future. Because if you put the revolutions in the Middle East together with the occupation of Wall Street, or the recent occupation movements in Taiwan, the occupation of the parliament, even the state council, which means that different sectors, that the capital size and the form of democracy, political parties are all in a it's a target against, right? We are not, so in that sense we use repeatedly that democracy. However, that the target itself became more and more ambiguous. What kind of the democracy we need to imagine for the future? That I think back to the movement itself, that will create the difficulty that from the mobilization to the politicization. Because even in the long transition, that the mass mobilization was very difficult to sustain to a certain extent, to politicize itself. So that's why after the mobilization, after the down of dictatorships, all the players in the political the fields were all the actors. Sounds like a repetition. So in that sense, we need to rethink maybe what's the repetition in a revolution and what's the revolution in repetition. I think that you are revealed clearly what's new in that, but that was still ambiguous. It's not, I think, that not only the moment itself, but the limits of our imagination about the future. Certainly, we are reconsideration, and the moment itself is need a kind of the more, let's say, that the kind of the interaction between these two fronts to generate the new thinking. This is the question. So how can we have a kind of the long transition through this mobilization to the new politics?
Thanks very much. Let's get another question with that one as well. Yeah, jump over here.
Listening to your comparison, let's say, between the 1950s or post-World War II Europe and the situation, I was thinking, okay, that in post-World War II Europe, well, people managed to find a new social contract, a political consensus quite soon, quite fast after the war, right? I was thinking that's a big difference. Maybe the society was more united, but then I reminded myself that in those days there was a major divide between, let's say, community in large part of Europe and Western Europe, France, Italy, etc., between communism and more conservative forces. And I guess maybe there's a relatively similar situation, comparable situation in the Middle East between, let's say, secular and Islamist, let's say, poles. So I was wondering if you could still think of what could be the elements of the social contract or of the political consensus similar to the one that emerged in Europe in the 1950s, in, let's say, the situation nowadays in the Middle East.
Okay, I think there's sort of parallel questions really. How do we, everybody agrees it's going to be a long, problematic process. How do we keep the long transition going? And is there a sort of social contract that can be constructed there which will sort of underpin democracy or whatever direction we want to go in? Anybody?
I think this is really the basic question, and what goes at the heart of the issue is the following. In my understanding of what's happening, there are two kind of tensions or two struggles going on at two different levels. And one is that the political, societal level, ideological level, which is the secular Islamist struggle. And the other one is at the economic level. At the economic level in terms which groups are benefiting or will benefit and what kind of new organization of the economy which will move us forward. And now these two struggles are not interacting well.
Right.
They are kind of being played at two different levels and they're not connected in a clear way. And my feeling is that really, and what I was trying to suggest is that once this secular Islamist, struggle is going to take, the outside unuseful part of it, it's going to be worked out within the economic sphere. And what are the social groups which are going to be supporting which political group for democracy to take root and for the political debate to take place. And this is going to take some time to work itself out. And I would like to make a comment on Sandra. My belief is that really it's not neoliberal against other, choices. I think that distinction between liberal and I think for me, my belief is that really we are past that. It's really what combination of, and even what has been discussed here in the CG and INET and so on, it's really what combination of role of the state and role of the private sector which is best, and this has to work itself out through the political process. And the dimensions of that political process, what are the players and so on, is still working itself out. and it's going to take time to work itself out.
Okay, anybody else like to comment on that one?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. To draw a kind of an opposition between neoliberalism and something else, exactly. But I go back to something that you just said, and then I think you reversed it, that there's the level of the economic, which then you said plays out the political. But for me, it's the level of the social. What changes in Europe is that, you know, the aristocracy and their sons get absolutely decimated. Their savings dry up. There's a mass force of workers that are mobilized to fight in 2 world wars. And for the first time, masses of laborers are put together with peasant associations, rural, urban. They're mobilized, radicalized, trained, clothed, fed. Did much more than any international could do. And they were able to see through demands by the time they were mobilized again for a Second World War, right from the start of the war, with the trade union, and this happened in the US and elsewhere. We now have moved to professional armies, so that'll never happen again. Elites now in the Middle East, they import Filipinos, etc., and keep them in barracks and send them home if they want to talk about wages. People learn. I mean, I think those who profit from owning what there is to own of value, they learn and they adjust. So for me, it's the balance of social forces. When does that shift? When there is a colossal human and material destruction, like in wars. When there are plagues, like the Black Plague, which decimated, that sort of thing. Where there's a shift in the balance of power, which empowers other groups, and it's not left to altruistic politicians or political leaders. It allows for a compromise in institutions that, as Immanuel Kant would say, are immune to the machinations of a society of devils that are durable.
Thanks. We don't want to leave the session on the notion that we want pestilence and war in the Middle East to hasten the revolution. So can somebody else ask a chap here?
Hello, my name is Jan Höfler. I'm from the University of Göttingen, Germany. In Germany, as you know, we had a very peaceful revolution in '89 and quite successful. And I think the reason why that was successful was because people knew that they had a role model that they would like to achieve. And they wanted freedom of expression, they wanted economic stability and improvements, they wanted to have freedom of movement, things like that, and it worked. And I think what happens at the moment is we are putting this at risk in the Arab countries. That's at least what I would believe, and what I also see from Arab population in Germany, is that they become critical of the Western world, because they see, for example, that there was this war of aggression in Iraq. The US media completely failed in reporting critically about the government. There was torture. There is a camp in Guantanamo that is completely illegal. There are people killed by drones without any trial. Aren't we risking to give away our moral role model?
Would anyone like to ask that? I mean, is the lack of a Western model which people... I mean, that presumes, of course, that the people on the streets are trying to copy the West, which may be a bit of a problematic idea, but anyway, how much impact has the sort of legacy of the wars and the drones and etc. had, do you think? We should probably touch on it before we finish.
Look, it matters, without a doubt. I mean, it's not, we can't ignore it. The Middle East, too often they've seen themselves as pawns in somehow a bigger game. So that, without a doubt, is an important issue. But I guess my point is, and I really hope that this comes out, is that the people today are not just referring to these big structural phenomena. It's not to say they don't matter. It's not to say that it doesn't have an impact. Increasingly, the blame is localized. It's being localized to the leaders. And for me personally, that's refreshing. Because I think when you have a blame that's uploaded to this very abstract isms, okay, Westernism, Americanism, I mean, you can't do anything about it. Those are big, huge megastructures. But the reality is so much of the problem and the accountability is in the hands of the leaders at the local level. And by that I mean the governments, the national governments. And that, to me, the Arab Spring has been, I think, an important aspect of the awakening, to bring down, to downgrade, if you will, responsibility onto those who really do matter. At the end of the day, decide that I don't want to build a factory, I want to build a mall. That's not Americanism, and I don't want to blame neoliberalism. At the end of the day, you have an opportunity to make a decision. Leaders have an opportunity to make a decision about what kind of productive society they want to create. And too often, I think we've used some of these structural explanations as a scapegoat.
Okay, I think that's a good note to end on. At least two of our three panelists are ultimately optimistic. So let's end on that optimistic note and thank them for a very interesting discussion.